Welcome to the Hair Loss Show. Dr. Russell Knudsen and Dr. Vikram Jayaprakash discuss issues relating to hair loss and the medical and surgical treatment of hair loss in both men and women.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Hair Loss Show, episode number 11. My name is Dr. Vikram Jayaprakash.
I'm Dr. Russell Knudsen.
Excellent. So today, we started, the last episode we talked about where hair transplant fits in. All right, so let's get down to the juicy stuff there. So there are two techniques with hair restoration surgery. There's what was known as FUT and FUE. So just to recap, hair transplantation, if you're doing surgery, you're moving the natural groupings of hairs that come out from the back of the scalp, and you're transplanting those to an area which is thinning and bald, and you're just effectively moving the grafts from one location to another. There are two techniques essentially in hair transplant surgery, FUT or FUE. Essentially, the outcome in the recipient area is the same. Where the area where you're looking for the growth, the outcome should be the same. The difference between the two techniques is how we harvest the hair from the back of the head. So, and we do both. All right, so we're not, a lot of people there sort of have one preference over another. We do both techniques, and the reason we do both techniques, is because we don't believe one is better than the other.
We think that they have particular applications where they might be useful, and it might be more about sequencing as to which one you do first and which one you do second. Absolutely. And which patient would be better for this technique and which patient would be better for that technique. But as Vikram said, essentially, we do not want you to be fooled by marketing which says that FUE is a superior technique. FUE is an alternative technique. So let's walk through how this works. Back in the 1950s in America, I explained in a previous podcast, we took these big punches because the dermatologist was using that technique. And so he took them one by one out of the back of the scalp, and he moved them to the top of the scalp. And that was the king of the hill, for about 20-25 years. It wasn't until the late 1970s that people decided that these blotchy scars on the back of the scalp maybe could be done a bit more efficiently if we put the punches next to each other and took them out. And that really required the development of carbonated steel punches that were sharp enough to do it, so to cut off the ledge, if you like, right, next to the previous one. So that only happened when we developed carbonated steel punches. So eventually, because these punches were put together, people thought, well, why don't we just take all of the tissue out and then cut them down into smaller pieces, when we decided to go to the smaller grafts, which was in about the early to mid 1980s. So that's what happened at that stage. So eventually we came to FUT, which is also known as strip surgery. Right. And what that means is we're taking out lips of skin like this. Okay, and we take the piece of skin, if I do it in 3 dimensions for you, it looks like this, and it has hairs in it. Right? The idea is to cut accurately parallel to the hair shafts so that you know that no damage to the hair shafts. And that whole piece of skin, depending on how much you take, will have approximately 150 to 200 hairs per square centimetre. And then you look for the natural groupings in there, right? You look for the natural groupings, the 2 and 3s or the 1s in there, and you make cuts in between them and cut them down into these follicular unit grafts. So the FU and FUT, even though we do it as a strip technique, only describes how you harvest the hairs, just like FUE only describes how you harvest the hairs, not what you do in the rest of the operation. So now you've taken this piece of skin out, you leave a gap on the back of the head. So what they do next is they pull it together and side up with stitches. Sutures, which can be dissolving or non-dissolving sutures. And that leaves you with a linear scar, which is what some people are a little bit nervous about, having a linear scar on the back of the head. But a couple of things need to be understood about this. Firstly, healing in the scalp is very good because the blood supply and the lymph drainage is very, very good, which means that the healing is usually very good and infection is rare. The second thing is, if you don't take too much width of the skin, you can use the natural flexibility of the scalp quite successfully, putting no tension on the wound edge. So that's important because you don't want the scar to stretch. and be a stretched scar. Now there's a bit of individual patient variation as to how scars feels, but in over 80% of cases they heal so beautifully that it's extremely difficult for them, their loved ones or their hairdresser to find where this came from. So this fear of the scar on the back of the head is often overblown. The second thing that I would say about it, if it's properly performed, is we then did a bit of a refined technique in the last 20 years called the trichophytic closure. I'm only saying that because I know some patients read about this and ask me about it. And what that essentially means is we overlap the edges of the scar so the hair grows back through the scar line, which again makes it less visible. So I guess my take-home message about strip is that the fear of having a wide and terrible scar is more about how the surgeon performed it rather than about the technique itself, right? A poorly performed taking of the ellipse of the skin, putting wound tension on the wound edge, particularly in risky areas, more risky areas like behind the ear, can create a bad scar. That's not the fault of the strip, that's the fault of the surgeon in most cases. So strip surgery in the world today probably is a little bit around about 45 to 50% of the operations being done in the world today. But it's still a very useful thing, and the thing that I want to emphasize about it is that it takes 100% of the hairs out of an area, right? So you're removing all of the hair in that area. And that, yes, you're using the natural flexibility of the scalp. Yes, it means that you're going to have a narrower zone on the back of the head with your healthy non-balding hairs or your non-weakened hairs, but that also has a potential advantage, and we'll come back to this in surgical planning, because if you do strip, you can harvest large numbers of hairs a long distance away from a balding margin.
That's right.
Which in a young patient is particularly beneficial because you don't know how much hair they're going to lose later in life. So to me, the big advantage of strip surgery is that if you start with strip surgery, particularly in young, extremely balding patients, you can move a large amount of hair well away from the balding margin using the natural flexibility of the scalp, leaving them with a very fine, almost invisible scar with hairs growing back through it using a proper closure and a proper technique. So to me, even though there are many clinics in the world now who will only perform what Dr. Vikram is going to talk about next, there is still a very, very good role for using strip surgery, and people should not fall into the trap of thinking that because FUE is the newer popular treatment of the moment, that it's superseded strip or FUT surgery and there's no role for FUT surgery. We are very strongly of the opinion that both these techniques are well executed, are excellent techniques, but they have their strengths, and like everything, they have their weaknesses.
But the key here is it comes down to a lot of planning, because we see, I mean, you can go online and you can Google bad FUT scars, and there are some horrific looking FUT scars. And yes, there are a small portion of patients who have a collagen disorder that may cause their scar to stretch. But in a lot of cases, bad strip scars come from
Bad surgery
or over harvesting, because if you're trying to take a strip, if you've got maximum balding, you've got effectively a distance from here to here. That's the maximum distance that you've got. That's a fixed length. So if you want more hairs, if you've got a surgeon who promises you more grafts, well, the only way you can do, if that's fixed, then the only only variable you have is changing the width of the strip that you've got. The wider you have the strip, the more tension that wound is under, the more likely it's going to stretch.
So the message there, people, is more isn't always better. That's right. There is a limit to what is using this technique, like there's a limit to FUE, which Dr. Vikram will talk about. There's a sensible limit to what you should do in a single session of grafting. And just remember, there's not unlimited hair to play with. So this comes down to planning, which we'll talk about in another show. So it's 100% of the hairs out of an area. If it's sensibly performed, it's a very useful technique. So let's go and talk about FUE.
All right. So FUE, interestingly enough, is, well, right now it's being heavily marketed as the latest technique, the latest technology, and there's lots of different punches out there that remove the grafts in the healthiest way. in essence, FUE is just a modification of the original technique that was done back in the...
What irony.
That's right. So initially, as Russell said, the punches were 4 or 5 millimeter, these punches that cored out tissue with sort of 10 or 15 hairs coming through, 20 hairs coming through them. And what we've learned is that we're trying to remove follicular units, the natural groupings of hairs. So what we've done is we've miniaturized those punches out and made them really small, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9 millimeters in diameter. And what we're doing is essentially doing the same thing, but punching out each individual follicular unit or graft. So FUE, again, we're taking hair from the back of the head, but what we're doing in essence, if this is the back of the head, and what we have to do is we have to shave the entire back of the head, and that leaves you with a whole selection of stubble hairs or grafts. And what we're doing with FUE is we're punching out that one, punching out that one, punching out that one, punching out, and so we're doing it in a scattered-like approach. Now, one of the fallacies that you sometimes might hear is that FUE is a scarless procedure. All right, don't do strip, do FUE because FUE is scarless. That's not true. There is no such thing as a scarless procedure. Anytime you take a sharp instrument to the skin, you are going to leave a scar.
But so hang on. So are you telling me you don't just pluck the hairs out?
No, you're actually you're coring them out and removing them, and that hair that you remove, or those grafts that you remove, will not grow back. So you will be left with a small circular scar in those areas, but it's tiny because it's dependent on punch size. So generally speaking, it's anywhere between 0.8 to 0.9 millimeters. So it's tiny in diameter, each one. And this, if peppered over a large area, will actually be virtually invisible to the naked eye. If you're growing your hair, you'd comb your hair up, and most people wouldn't, unless you knew what you were looking for, wouldn't see anything that was there. So that's where the scarless thing comes from. But in essence, it's not scarless. You are taking hair from the back of the head, and these hairs do not grow back. And
so minimally visible scarring if performed correctly.
And that is the key, because if performed correctly, because you do not have an infinitely renewable source. This is a non-renewable source. You are robbing Peter to pay Paul. All right. So any hair that you remove from here will not grow back. So if you are someone you get someone says, listen, more is better, let's do more. Well, then you're going to be removing more. And these scars, now the density of those scars now become close together. And if they start becoming close together, then the hair at the back of the head starts looking patchy.
So you've transferred the baldness to the back of the head.
That's right. And the back of the head now looks moth-eaten and...
So ideally, how much hair in a single session in an area do you want to remove with FUE?
In a single session? Well, look, that's a loaded question, because it depends on A, the density of hair that you've got at the back of the head, and also the amount of balding. Because unlike strip surgery, where you're removing 100% of the hairs from the safest area at the back of the head, because you are doing a scatter approach with FUE, you have to widen that area. And this becomes the trick there, or this becomes the risk. If your area becomes too wide, are you encroaching on an area that potentially may become bald in the future? And if that's the case, then that hair that you've transplanted may not last.
All right, so let's do a little bit of simple math to explain the point that Vikram's making. If you take 20% of the hairs out of an area versus 100% out of this area, then to get the same number of grafts, you have to use 5 times larger an area to get the same number of grafts. Right? If you take 25% of the hairs out of the area, then you still need 4 times larger area to harvest to get the same number of grafts. Now we know that in this technique we wouldn't want to take more than 50% of the area out, because then it would become see-through. Mm-hmm. Right? So you've got to take this low number out, which means you've got to use a much larger area. Now, for small areas of baldness and small transplant sessions,
no problem.
Not going to be an issue, right? This really becomes an irrelevant question. But where it becomes particularly relevant is in our younger, bald extensively bald patients. They've got a lot of baldness, which means they've got less donor, but they want the big area covered, and they want the modern thing, which is to wear their hair short on the back of the head. And so they have this fear about a linear scar that'll become visible if they have a really short haircut, versus this speckled appearance that, if it's not over harvested, might be less visible. And that's a valid question, that it might be less visible. But the equally valid point is, you have to go through a large area to get a large number of grafts. And as you said, our fear in our younger patients is that we're going to harvest areas that in future may go bald, which has two critical problems. Number one, if you harvest from an area that later is going bald around it, your graft will go bald. So you're losing the hair that you transplanted to the top of the head. That's a big problem. Number two, if there's no hair between the scars, guess what? Those scars are going to be pretty damn visible. So you've created two problems if you harvest inappropriately. So these are why we are both emphasizing to everybody listening to the podcast that it's not black and white about what's a better technique. They both have their advantages, and in certain circumstances, one technique might be better than others. So I like to try and, because we provide both techniques, one of the nice things I think is that we can actually say to the patient, here is the risk versus the reward of this technique, here is the risk versus the reward of that technique, and by giving that balanced view to the patient can make up their own mind what they think is better in their circumstance, rather than relying upon slick marketing that says there's only one technique now. And remember, the reality is, when people say, oh, but FUE gives better growth, doesn't it? It can't, because
it's the same
this
graft.
is a harvesting technique to get the same graft, right? So the reality is, you can't get a better result using FUE compared to properly performed FUT, because you've got the same graft. The other parts of the operation, which is the creation of the sites in the scalp and the planting of the grafts, are what determine the success of that part of the operation, not how you actually harvested the graft.
Now, it may sound, I mean, I've just been listening to what we're saying, that we're kind of pushing towards FUT versus FUE, and that's not the case. Like Russell said, we do both techniques. We really like both techniques. They have a place. Both techniques have a place. I think where we are at this point in time, a lot of people are pushing FUE, and the worry that we have is that people are getting pushed into one technique without understanding what are the consequences of that. And the one other thing, which is probably a moot point but may not be important, people go, I actually want FUE over FUT because I don't want as much scarring. If you did the mathematics of the whole thing and calculated what the surface area of this scar is versus what the surface area of the combined dot-like scars, the scarring in FUE is probably a factor of 5 or 6 times more than the equivalent number of grafts in a strip. So it's not necessarily it's less scarring, that's not the case. FUE is great, it gives you dot-like scars peppered over a large area, and that gives you the ability to wear shorter hairstyles at the back of the head, but it is not the panacea. There are issues with it, and if you are thinking about having hair transplant, make sure you consult with someone who is not got a vested interest in giving you one technique over the other, that has the ability to offer you both and therefore can give you sound advice.
So the take-home message, people, is yes, you get to choose what makes sense to you, but it's not FUT versus FUE in the real world. It's FUT and FUE as two valid alternative ways of harvesting follicular unit grafts from the back of the head. They both have a role to play. And it really is important for the patient to understand when they come in what's involved, what the benefits are potentially there of doing this technique versus the other technique, and what are the risks of doing this technique versus the other technique. So the take-home message is the world of transplanting is still about FUT and FUE. I hope this has helped give you a little bit more clarity about the issue. We will spend more time talking about the rest of the transplant and the issues involved in that in future podcasts. But for now, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast.
Thanks very much. See you next time.